Hello again. Today we're going to be looking at another wonderful topic still on reproductive system in plants. Reproductive system in plants. I remember we started by looking at plants. We said that plants have several parts where they have the roots, they have the stems, they have the leaves, they also have flowers. And flowers are the reproductive parts of a plant. And then we said that plants with flowers are called flowering plants. And I told you they also undergo both sexual and asexual reproduction. Actually, we are looking at sexual reproduction in plants. And we said that sexual reproduction in plants is carried out by fertilization. And this simply means that flowering plants, they can produce gametes. They also have gametes. And we established some important aspects of which we looked at the types of flowering of flowers. We talked about the inflorescence, we talked about the solitary, we talked about the perfect, the imperfect, regular, irregular, complete, incomplete, essential parts of a flower, non-essential parts of the flower. We talked about monoecious flowers. We also looked at dioecious flowers. And we also looked at the structure of a flower. I told you that the flower consists of a pedicel which is attached to the stem, which attaches the flower itself to the stem. We also said that a flower consists or has or possesses a receptacle, a cup-shaped receptacle, which holds and which carries and holds together the floral parts of the flower. And then we also talked about the sepals. We said the sepals, they carry the other floral parts of the flower and as well as protect the other flower parts of the flower. We talked about the petals. We also said that the petals, they attract insects for pollination. And then we talked about the stamens, which produces the male reproductive or male gamete. And then we have the carpels, which produces the female gamete. Another name for the stamens can be called androcium. Another name for stamens is androcium. Another name for the carpels is gynocium. Gynocium. And we said that we also have the floral parts of the flower. And I told you that there are 4 floral parts of the flower. We have the sepals, we have the petals, we have the stamens or the androcium, and then we have the carpels or the gynocium, or you can call it the pistil. Now, we also mentioned the ovaries, types of ovaries. And we said we have 3 types of ovaries. We have the superior, we have the half inferior, and then we have the inferior ovary. And we also discussed placentation. We said placentation has to do with the arrangement of ovules within the ovary of a flower. And we looked at 5 of them. We talked about marginal placentation. We talked about free central. We talked about the axial. We talked about parietal. And then also we looked at basal placentation. Now, today we're going to be continuing from where we stopped. Now, we have looked at the structure of a flower, but before reproduction will actually commence, there is a particular process that must be in place before reproduction commences. And that process is what we call pollination. So today we're going to be strictly talking about pollination in flowering plants. Now, these are some of the subtopics we're going to be looking at. We're going to define pollination. We're also going to be looking at the types of pollination. We're also going to describe wind-pollinated flowers as well as insect-pollinated flowers. We're going to do a big description on them. And also by the end of this particular class, you should be able to define pollination. You should also be able to mention and explain the types of pollinations in flowering plants. And then you should be able to briefly explain wind and the process of wind and insect pollination, okay, or pollinated flowers, their characteristics. And also you should be able to tell the difference between the two of them. Difference between wind-pollinated flowers and insect-pollinated flowers, and it is strictly based on their characteristics. So let's begin this particular topic with the definition of pollination. Now, as the name implies, pollination is actually the transfer of mature pollen grains. It is the transfer of mature pollen grains from the anther to the mature stigma of the same flower or another flower of the same plant or closely related species of plants. I repeat it again. I said it is the transfer of mature pollen grains from the anther to the mature stigma of the same flower or of another flower of the same plant or closely related species. So if you look at that particular definition, you are going to understand that there are several keywords to take note of. One is mature pollen grains. Another is, where does this mature pollen grains comes from? It actually comes from the anther of the flower. And then also there is a presence of mature stigma. And please take note of these two words, same or another flower. They said, in our definition, we said the transfer can be done on the same flower. It can also be done with another flower. Now, this brings us to something very important, which we'll be discussing as we continue this particular class. But also, please take note that pollination precedes fertilization in plants. Just the same way in terms of animals, courtship behavior precedes fertilization in animals. In the same manner, pollination precedes fertilization in plants. So before fertilization will take place, pollination must be in place. Now, we have different types of pollination. Now, based on the definition we gave the other time, or we gave concerning pollination, we said it is the transfer of mature pollen grains from the anther to the mature stigma of the same flower or of another flower. So this particular definition gives us an idea of two types of pollination. Now, we have what we call self-pollination, and then we also have what we call cross-pollination. And we will be exploring into these two types of pollination. Let's start with the first one, which is self-pollination. What is self-pollination? Self-pollination can simply be defined as the transfer of mature pollen grains from the anther to the mature stigma of the same flower or another flower of the same plant. If it is of the same plant or of the same flower, it is referred to as self-pollination. So self-pollination involves only one parent plant, or you can say it involves only one parent flower. So if it is done in the same plant or in the same flower, if this transfer is done in the same plant or in the same flower, we refer to it as self-pollination. That is self-pollination. Now, there are some plants that undergo self-pollination. Not all plants undergo self-pollination. Examples of plants that undergo self-pollination or carry out pollination, they include, we have cotton plant, we have tomato plant, we have the pea plant, that's the garden pea plant. If you check our videos on genetics, when we're talking about Mendel's experiment, you will agree with me, we mentioned about self-pollination. self-pollination. So garden pea plant also undergoes self-pollination, okay? Now, self-pollination, there are several conditions that are actually necessary for self-pollination to occur. There are conditions, and we're going to be looking at these conditions. Number one condition is homogamy. Homogamy. Now, what is actually homogamy? Homogamy is a condition in which the anther and the stigma of a bisexual flower. Remember, we've talked about bisexual flower. I repeat again, it's a condition. Okay, what is bisexual flower? A bisexual flower is a flower that has both male and female parts in it. Okay, in a particular plant, where you have the male flower and the female flower in a particular plant. It is referred, or in different plants rather, we refer to that as a bisexual plant. We refer to it as a bisexual plant. Now, this is a condition in which the anther and the stigma of a bisexual flower ripens or matures at the same time. When they ripen or mature at the same time, bisexual flower, it has both male and female parts present in one flower. Most times we call bisexual flowers hermaphrodites. Okay, they are found in the same flower. Now, if both anther and stigma ripens at the same time or becomes mature at the same time, we call that homogamy. And in fact, homogamy brings about self-pollination. Because if the anther doesn't ripe to rupture and ruptures to release the pollen grains, even if the stigma is mature but the anther is not mature, there will be no self-pollination. But even if also in the other way around, if the stigma the anther is mature and releases pollen grains, mature pollen grains, but the stigma is not ripened or mature, there will be no pollination. No self-pollination will occur. So homogamy must be in place for self-pollination to actually occur. Another one is called cleistogamy. Cleistogamy. Now, cleistogamy is a condition in which ripe pollen grains are deposited on the stigma, which becomes ripened at the same time. I repeat, it is actually a condition in which ripe pollen grains are deposited on the stigma, which ripens or becomes ripened or mature at the same time. So cleistogamy occurs mostly in closed bisexual flowers. It occurs mostly in closed bisexual flowers. Now, advantages of self-pollination. Now, these are some of the advantages of self-pollination. Number one, self-pollination, the pollen grains are not wasted during this process. Pollen grains are not wasted, unlike in cross-pollination, as the agents are carrying these pollen grains from one plant or one flower to another. There is every possibility for these pollen grains to fall off or fall to the ground, and then that's a waste. So, but in terms of self-pollination, pollen grains are not wasted. Number two is that it is a sure way of ensuring pollination in bisexual flowers. A sure way of ensuring pollination in bisexual flowers. Now, what are the disadvantages of self-pollination? Self-pollination leads to the production of weak offsprings. It leads to the production of weak offsprings as a result of continuous self-pollination. Results in the production of weak offsprings. Number two, disadvantage of self-pollination is that the offspring produced are less adapted to their environment. They are less adapted to their environment. Next is cross-pollination. What is cross-pollination? Cross-pollination is actually the transfer of mature pollen grains from the anther of a flower to the stigma or to the mature stigma of a flower of another plant of the same or closely related species. It must be a transfer to another plant of another flower. Now, during cross-pollination, two parent plants are involved. Two parent plants are involved during cross-pollination. Now, examples of some of the plants that undergo cross-pollination includes, we have Pride of Barbados, we have hibiscus flower, we have the morning glory. All these are examples of plants that undergo cross-pollination. Now, what are some of the conditions actually necessary for cross-pollination to take place? Number one is that there must be dichogamy. Remember, in self-pollination, we called it homogamy. But in terms of cross-pollination, it is called dichogamy. Now, what is dichogamy? Dichogamy is actually a condition in which the anther and the stigma ripens at different times in a bisexual flower. They ripen at different times in a bisexual flower. Now, we have two types of dichogamy. One is called the protrandry. Protrandry. Now, protrandry is actually the condition in which the anther matures before the stigma. The anther matures before the stigma of that flower. But protogyny, I said there are two, protrandry, and the second one is called protogyny. Now, in terms of protogyny, it is the stigma that matures before the anther. I hope you get the difference. In protrandry, it is the anther that matures before the stigma. But in protogyny, it is the stigma that matures before the anther. Okay? So that is one of the conditions necessary for cross-pollination to actually take place. Another condition necessary for cross-pollination to actually occur is called unisexuality. Unisexuality. Now, unisexuality is a condition in which some plants bear only a male or a female flower. They bear either a male flower or a female flower. Now, if you have a male flower and then you have a different female flower, definitely there must be cross-pollination. Definitely there must be cross-pollination. So that is also another condition that must be in place for cross-pollination to actually occur. And the third one is self-sterility. Now, self-sterility is actually a condition in which some plants make themselves sterile. They make themselves unreproductive. Okay? Now, for instance, in some plants, the presence of pollen on their stigma, the presence of pollen from the same flower on their stigma is injurious to further development of the plant, to the extent that the plant can wither and die. So in other words, if pollen from the same flower lands on their stigma, on the same stigma of that same flower, it can be injurious. It can bring about a termination. It can cause the plant to actually wither and die. So not all plants do this. There are some plants that make themselves sterile. Okay? They decide to become unreproductive when pollen from the same flower lands on the stigma. So these are three important conditions necessary for cross-pollination to take place. Number one is dichogamy, number two is unisexuality, and then number three is self-sterility. Now, let's take a look at some advantages and disadvantages of cross-pollination. Now, starting with the advantages of cross-pollination. Number one advantage of cross-pollination, in fact, the advantages of cross-pollination is the disadvantages of self-pollination. So number one, it leads to the production of healthier offsprings. So the offsprings produced are strong, viable, and healthy. And number two, it also leads to the production of viable seeds. Seeds that are healthy, seeds that are alive, seeds that are active. So viable seeds are produced during cross-pollination. And also the offsprings that are being produced are more adapted to their environment. Remember, in self-pollination, the offsprings are less adapted. But in terms of cross-pollination, the offsprings are more adapted to their environment. And then lastly, it leads to the formation of new varieties. Of course, it leads to the formation of new varieties. Now, what are some of the disadvantages of cross-pollination? Number one is that it leads to wastage of pollen grains. Very true. Most times when these pollen grains are being transferred or carried from one flower to another, there are possibilities that these pollen grains might fall off, might die off, and might be carried away by so many things. And that is a waste. That is a very big waste. So it leads to wastage. It leads to wastage of pollen grains. And then number two, it will always rely on external agents for the whose right time you can't guarantee. You can't guarantee the right time these agents of pollination will be available. You can't guarantee. For instance, if it is wind that actually helps in pollinating a particular flower, when will the wind come? You are not certain when the wind comes. You don't even know, or the plant does not even know the right time the wind will blow. But when it does, it can also lead to wastage. So these are some of the disadvantages of cross-pollination. Now let's take a look at agents of pollination. Now, pollination cannot be effective or cannot take place without agents. There are agents. There are agents. They can be both biotic and abiotic agents. Okay. Now, agents are simply means by which pollination occurs. Now, agents of pollination can also be referred to as pollinators. You can call them pollinators. So they help to bring about pollination. They are called pollinators. Now, examples of some of the pollinators, we have insects. Insects are very good pollinators or agents of pollination, and we're going to be talking about that. So insects are there. We also have birds. We have wind. Yes. We also have water. We have snails. We have bats. We also have humans or man. These are some of the agents of pollination. So we can actually categorize them into biotic and abiotic agents. Now, when we're talking about the abiotic factors, we're talking about the non-living factors. When we're talking about the biotic factors, we're looking at the living factors. So we can classify wind and water under abiotic, and then also we can classify insects, birds, snails, bats, and even man under what? Biotic. We can put them under biotic factors. All right? Now, let's take a look at major agents of pollination. There are several agents that are responsible. In fact, there are two major agents of pollination. It simply means that they cause or bring about, these two agents bring about pollination frequently. Number one of them, of all of them, is insects. So there are several insects that their activities always brings about pollination, always brings about the transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma. Another major agent of pollination or pollinator is wind. And we're going to be looking at these two. We're going to be looking at wind-pollinated flowers. We're going to be looking at wind-pollinated flowers. We're also going to be looking at the process of pollination by wind. How does wind carry out pollination? Now, let's start with the first one, which is wind-pollinated flowers. Let's look at some characteristics of wind-pollinated flowers and what they look like. Number one is that wind-pollinated flowers have small, inconspicuous petals. and sepals. Another thing again you notice in wind-pollinated flowers is that the petals are dull. They are not brightly colored. They are dull colored. In fact, another important characteristics of wind-pollinated flowers is that there is an absence of scent. It doesn't have a scent. It doesn't also have nectar. Now, these are most of the things that attracts insects to most flowers. So when there is an absence of nectar, there is an absence of scent. When there is the petals are not brightly colored, most insects are not attracted. And that's why wind-pollinated flowers cannot be pollinated by what? Insects. Okay. Then also another characteristics of wind-pollinated flowers is that they have large quantity of pollen. There are large quantities of pollen that are always produced. The reason why there you see large quantity of pollen is because while the wind is carrying this pollen from transferring it from one place to another, mostly by cross-pollination, most of this pollen are wasted. So if it carries a large quantity of it, not all make it to their destination of, which is the stigma. So large quantity of pollen is also another important characteristics of wind-pollinated flowers. We also have stigma is elongated and sticky with large surface area. And then finally, the final characteristics of wind-pollinated flowers is that the pollen grains are small, smooth, light, and not sticky. They are light, so that they can be easily carried by the wind. The pollen grains are smooth, the pollen grains are light, so they can be easily carried by the wind. Now, wind-pollinated flowers are called anemophilous flowers. Wind-pollinated flowers, one time again, they are called anemophilous flowers. They are referred to as anemophilous flower. So if you check this structure here, this is a wind-pollinated flower. Tridax is a wind-pollinated flower. Now, next is the process of pollination by wind. Process of pollination by wind. Now, how does pollination take place by wind? Number one, the first step is that the male flower ripens before the female flower on the same plant. This favors cross-pollination. We've talked about this, which is dichogamy. And then the next thing that happens is that the wind carries the pollen grains to another plant with ripe female flowers. Now, if it falls on a ripe stigma, cross-pollination is said to have what? Occurred. Cross-pollination is said to have what? Occurred. So this is the process of pollination by wind. Process of pollination by wind. The next we're going to be looking at is insect-pollinated flowers. Insect-pollinated flowers. Now, insect-pollinated flowers are actually flowers that are pollinated by insects. Now, take a look at the structure, the screen there. We have a brightly colored flower, and you can see insects pollinating it. Now, what are some of the characteristics of insect-pollinated flowers? Number one is that they have large conspicuous petals, not small. Large conspicuous petals and sepals. And then number two is that the petals are brightly colored. As you can see here, the petals are brightly colored. And also in this flower, the flower produces scent. Okay? There is presence of scent in the flowers. Now, these are what attracts the insect. The brightly colored petals, the well-scented petals, and that these petals also produce what we call nectar. And it is this nectar that it is on this nectar that these insects actually feed from. You have insects like butterflies, you have the bees, and so on. They feed on these nectar. All right. Now, another important characteristic of insect-pollinated flowers is that the pollen grains are rough. They are not smooth, as we have seen in wind-pollinated flowers. They are rough, they are sticky so that they can stick to the bodies of these insects. They are rough, they are sticky, and as well as few. So they are also few. Now, the last characteristics of insect-pollinated flowers is that the stigma is flat with sticky surface to enable it receive pollen grains, Now, insect-pollinated flowers are called entomophilous flowers. Insect-pollinated flowers are called entomophilous flowers. Some examples of insect-pollinated flowers includes, we have the Pride of Barbados, we have hibiscus flower, we also have Delinox, we also have the Crotalaria, and so many other types of insect-pollinated flowers. Now, before we go, I want us to take a look at the process of process through which flowers are pollinated by insects. Let's look at them. Now, once you see, like we've just seen based on the characteristics of insect-pollinated flowers, we said one of the major characteristics is that the petals are brightly colored and also they are well scented. Now, what actually attracts these insects to these flowers are mostly the brightly colored petals and the well-scented petals. So once they come based on these attractions, they land on the standard petals. Once they land on the standard petals, they uncoil their proboscis. Mostly where you have coiled proboscis is mostly in the butterfly. So once it lands on the standard petals, the butterfly uncoils its proboscis and sucks in nectar. Now, while it is doing that, most times, and I've also seen in the characteristics that the pollen grains are rough and they are sticky. So most times these pollen grains or these sticky pollen grains adhere or attach themselves to the hairy bodies of these insects. So once this particular insect has finished sucking nectar from a particular flower, as it flies to another flower, on getting to another flower or visiting another flower in order to suck nectar, most times these pollen grains that are attached to their body fall off, and if they fall on a mature stigma, that brings about cross-pollination. So cross-pollination can take place. So this is also another process, or this is the process rather by which insects pollinate flowers. Now, this brings us to the end of this particular topic on pollination. But before we go, I'd like us to take a look at some few questions using the Examguide app. Let's take a look at, should be SSC. Very few questions, we have 3. They said, which of the following structures is not essential in wind-pollinated flowers? Which of the following structures is not essential, not important in wind-pollinated flowers? A, is it the petals? B, is it the stigma? C, is it the anther? And D, is it the ovary? Of course, the anther plays a major role. It releases the pollen grains. Of course, the stigma is what receives the pollen grains for pollination to effectively take place. And then the petals, they attract these insects that helps in pollination. All right. Now, if you look at all of this, the one that is not essential in wind-pollinated flowers is the presence of petals. Now, petals have nothing to do with wind-pollinated flowers. If it is an insect-pollinated flowers, yes, we can say it has a big effect on pollination. So the correct one that is not essential is the petals. Number 2, which of the following statement best describes pollination? We said pollination is the transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigmas, A. B says from the anther of a flower to the stigma of another flower of a different species. C says from the stigma to the stamens, and D says from the anther to the ovary. The correct answer is the transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma, all right? So to the stigmas. So the A is the correct option. So that best describes pollination. Number 3 says the transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma of the same flower. Of the same flower is referred to as what? A is the correct answer, which is self-pollination. Self-pollination, not fertilization, not conjugation, not reproduction. Self-pollination. All right. So let's take a look at also UTME. Let's look at UTME and see some few questions here. Now, they said here the male inference is labeled 1, but we're not looking at this. We want to relate it to pollination. Now, look at this. They said the illustration is a typical example of a plant pollinated by. Now, if you look at this plant is a maize plant. Maize plants, they don't have anything to attract themselves there. Now, they can be pollinated by birds. They can be pollinated by man. They can also be pollinated by wind. But as it stands, the best, when we're looking at the major agents of pollination between insect and wind, what the correct option here is D, which is wind. They are pollinated mostly by wind. Now look at this question. They said the transfer of pollen grains from the anther to a receptive stigma is actually called pollination. Next question says, which of the following is the effect of using artificial pollination in plant breeding? Of course, it improves improvement of the variety of crops. Improvement of the variety of crops, though we didn't mention that. Now, the next one says the transfer of pollen grains from the anther is the repetition, is called pollination. And then finally, look at that particular question there. They said the likely pollinating agent of this flower, if you can see, though it's still in black and white, but this flower look at the petals are conspicuous. They are large and conspicuous. It means they are also brightly colored. And if they are brightly colored, it simply means they can be pollinated by insects. They can be pollinated by insects. So this is where we call it a wrap-up in this particular class on pollination, that is reproductive system in plants, and we are actually looking at pollination. I hope you enjoyed the class. I'll see you in our next video. Bye for now.